Hello, fictional. Welcome to the What If Essay. Today we are gonna see, what if Issei become a god of destruction? If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Issei had always dreamed of becoming a harem king, basking in the affection of beautiful women, while living the carefree life of a devil. But dreams often took unexpected detours, and Issei's life was about to take a turn that no one, not even he, could have foreseen. It was a quiet afternoon at the Occult Research Club. Ria's Gremory, the red-haired devil princess and leader of the club, was sitting at her desk reviewing documents from the underworld. The rest of the club members Akeno, Kiba, Kaneko, and Asia were engaged in their usual activities. Issei, as always, found his attention wandering toward Ria's and Akeno, his mind clouded with his typical perverted thoughts. Just another ordinary day for Issei and the club. But then, everything changed. A sudden, violent shift in the air sent shivers down everyone's spine. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a thick, oppressive energy filled the space. Issei's senses went into overdrive as he felt the raw, overwhelming presence of something ancient, something far beyond the powers of devils, angels, or fallen angels. Everyone, stay alert. Ria's commanded, rising from her seat, her aura flaring up in preparation for a possible threat. Before anyone could react, a figure materialized in the center of the room. Cloaked in black, with eyes that burned like molten lava, the being exuded an aura so heavy that the club members struggled to breathe under its weight. The room crackled with energy, the sheer power radiating from the entity was unlike anything they had encountered before. Who are you? Issei managed to choke out, his voice trembling slightly. He felt as if he were standing before a walking apocalypse. The figure's eyes turned toward Issei, locking onto him with an intensity that made his heart pound in his chest. You are the one I seek. The voice was deep, ancient, and full of power. It resonated in Issei's bones, like the voice of a god. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the club members instinctively stepped back, their instincts warning them of the danger. I am Earbus, the figure spoke, his presence looming over Issei. God of destruction. A stunned silence followed as Earbus's words hung in the air. Issei's mind raced, trying to comprehend the gravity of what had just been revealed. A god of destruction. What could someone like that want with him? I don't understand. Why me? Issei asked, his usual bravado replaced with genuine confusion and fear. The weight of Earbus's gaze pressed down on him like a physical force. Earbus took another step closer. The previous god of destruction has fallen, his power lost to the void. The balance of destruction and creation is fragile. A new god must rise, and you, Issei, have been chosen. Issei's heart skipped a beat. He could barely process what was happening. He looked around the room, hoping to find reassurance in the faces of his friends, but they were just as shocked as he was. Ria's, ever the leader, stepped forward, her expression fierce and protective. You can't just choose him for something like that, Ria said, her voice strong despite the fear that gripped her. Issei is part of my peerage. If you want him, you'll have to go through us first. Earbus let out a low, rumbling chuckle. I have no need for conflict, Lady Gremory. The decision has already been made by forces far greater than you or I, whether you approve or not, Issei's destiny has been set. Issei swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. Wait, I'm supposed to become a god of destruction. Isn't that a bit much? I'm just a regular devil. Earbus's expression remained stoic. You are far more than that, Issei. The potential within you, the strength that lies dormant, makes you the perfect candidate. As the new god of destruction, you will hold power that rivals the greatest beings in existence. But with that power comes responsibility and the burden of destruction. The word sent a chill down Issei's spine. Power. Responsibility. Destruction. It was all too much, too fast. He could feel his heart racing, his mind swirling with fear and doubt. Could he really handle something like this? Was he truly capable of wielding the power of a god? I don't know if I can do this, Issei muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Ria's moved closer to him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Issei, you don't have to do this. We'll find another way. But deep down, Issei knew that this wasn't something he could walk away from. The sense of inevitability was overwhelming. Earbus had said it himself, this was his destiny. And as terrifying as it was, some part of Issei couldn't help but feel a strange sense of curiosity. What happens if I refuse? Issei asked, his voice shaking. Earbus's expression darkened. Refusal is not an option. If you do not accept the mantle, the balance between destruction and creation will collapse. Entire worlds could be erased from existence. A heavy silence followed. The weight of the situation settled on Issei's shoulders. He couldn't refuse, not when the stakes were so high. But the idea of becoming a god of destruction, it was too much. Could he really handle that kind of power without losing himself? Fine, Issei finally said, his voice steadying. I'll do it. But only if you promise me one thing. Earbus raised an eyebrow, curious. And what is that? I want to stay who I am, Issei said, glancing at Rias and his friends. I won't let this power turn me into something I'm not. I'm still Issei Haidu, and that's not gonna change. For the first time, Earbuss smiled a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. Very well. But know this, Issei Haidu power changes all who wield it. You may find it harder to remain who you are than you think. Issei nodded, knowing full well the risk he was taking. But he couldn't let fear stop him. He had to do this, not just for himself, but for his friends. He couldn't let them down. Without another word, Earbuss reached out, placing his hand on Issei's chest. The moment their contact was made, a surge of raw, primal energy flooded through Issei's body. He felt his entire being ignite with power beyond anything he had ever imagined. It was as if the very fabric of reality bent to his will, trembling under the weight of his newfound strength. Issei gasped as the energy coursed through him, his vision blurring as the room around him seemed to distort. His friends called out to him, but their voices were distant, echoing as if from another world. And then, it was over. Issei collapsed to his knees, panting heavily. He felt different, stronger, more aware of the world around him. But there was something else too, a darkness, a hunger for destruction that lurked beneath the surface. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. Rias rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. Issei, are you okay? Issei nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. Yeah, I think so. But as he spoke, he felt a subtle tremor in the air around him, a flicker of destructive energy that he could barely control. His friends had felt it too, their expressions uneasy. Issei, Rias whispered, her voice filled with concern. Issei looked up at her, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He had accepted the mantle of the god of destruction, but at what cost? I don't know what's going to happen, Issei said quietly, his gaze shifting to the floor. But I'll figure it out. I have to. And as the first signs of his destructive power began to surface, Issei couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. The day after Issei accepted the mantle of the god of destruction, the air around him seemed heavier. He could feel it in every breath, every step, the energy of destruction coursing through his veins like a constant restless storm. His body felt different, stronger, more attuned to the forces around him, but also unstable, like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. His usual carefree and playful nature felt distant, replaced by something deeper, more intense. And that scared him. Rias, always the ever-vigilant leader, had called for a training session to help Issei adjust to his new powers. The entire occult research club was present at the training grounds, a large open field secluded from the eyes of the human world. It was the safest place for them to practice without causing unwanted attention, or so they hoped. Issei stood in the middle of the field, his eyes closed as he tried to focus on the swirling energy within him. He could feel it, like a living thing pulsing just beneath the surface of his skin, waiting to be unleashed. But every time he tried to tap into it, the power felt wild, uncontrollable. Issei, are you ready? Ria's voice cut through the haze of his thoughts. Opening his eyes, Issei looked at her. She was standing a few feet away, her crimson hair flowing gently in the wind, her eyes full of both concern and determination. Akeno stood beside her, her usual playful smile replaced with a more serious expression. The rest of the club, Kiba, Kaneko, and Asia, stood farther back, watching intently. Everyone was waiting for him. Yeah, I think so, Issei muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure. Rias nodded. Take it slow. Don't try to force anything. We're here to help you. Issei took a deep breath, focusing on the energy within him. He raised his hand, trying to channel a small amount of destructive power. At first, nothing happened, but then he felt an intense surge of energy flooding through him, far stronger than he intended. His hand glowed with a dark crimson aura, crackling with raw destructive power. The ground beneath him began to tremble, cracks forming as the destructive energy seeped into the earth. Issei's heart raced as he struggled to contain it, but the power was wild, chaotic. The aura around his hand grew larger, more unstable. Issei, calm down. Rias called out, her voice laced with worry. I can't control it. Issei gritted his teeth, trying to suppress the energy, but it was too much. The power exploded outward in a burst of red light, sending a shockwave across the field. The ground shook violently, and a nearby boulder shattered into dust. Rias and Akeno barely managed to erect a barrier in time to shield the group from the blast. When the dust settled, Issei stood in the center of the destruction, panting heavily, his hands still glowing with residual energy. I'm sorry. Issei gasped, looking around at the damage he had caused. The once peaceful field now had a large crater in the center, and the boulder he had accidentally destroyed was nothing more than a pile of rubble. Rias lowered her barrier, her expression a mix of concern and determination. She stepped toward Issei, her hands reaching out to touch his shoulders. It's okay, Issei. You're still adjusting. This kind of power, it's not easy to control. Issei looked into her eyes, guilt gnawing at him. I didn't mean to. I don't know how to stop it." Akeno approached from behind, placing a comforting hand on Issei's arm. "You're not alone in this, Issei. We'll help you. But you need to stay calm. Destruction feeds off emotion, anger, fear, even excitement." Issei swallowed hard. The truth was, he wasn't just struggling with his powers, he was scared of them. Scared of what they could do if he lost control again. He had never wanted this kind of power. He was supposed to be the perverted hero who fought for his friends, not the destroyer who could tear the world apart with a single misstep. Rias could see the conflict in his eyes. She gently squeezed his shoulders, her voice softening. "We'll take it slow, okay? You're not going to lose yourself. You're still Issei Haidu, no matter what." Her words were meant to reassure him, but there was an undercurrent of fear in her voice, a fear that she herself didn't fully understand. Rias had always been confident in Issei's abilities, his bravery, his loyalty, but this power was something else. It was far beyond anything they had encountered before. And as much as she wanted to believe in him, the destructive energy surrounding him was like a ticking time bomb. Still, she couldn't deny the growing feelings she had for him. Watching him struggle, seeing the weight of the power he had been forced to carry, made her heart ache. She wanted to protect him, but more than that, she wanted to be with him. She had always been drawn to Issei's warmth, his unrelenting passion for his friends, but now, there was something deeper. Something more dangerous, yet more enticing. As the group took a break from training, Rias sat beside Issei on a nearby rock. The others were scattered around, giving them space. Akeno and Kaneko whispered quietly to each other, while Kiba was busy inspecting the damage from Issei's earlier outburst. Asia was off to the side, silently watching, her worry evident. "You're really worried about me, huh?" Issei said, breaking the silence between him and Rias. She turned to him, her deep blue eyes meeting his. "Of course, I am. This power you have now, it's dangerous. But it doesn't change who you are." Issei looked down at his hands, still feeling the residual energy humming just beneath the surface. "But what if it does? What if I can't control it? What if I end up hurting you?" Rias shook her head, her hand gently resting on his. "I trust you, Issei. No matter what happens, I know you'll find a way to control it. You're not alone in this." Issei smiled weakly, but his mind was still clouded with doubt. He appreciated her faith in him, but the fear of losing control was real. He had seen what his powers could do with just a small slip. If something like that happened again, if he lost control in a battle, or worse, around his friends, he didn't know if he could live with the consequences. "I just don't want to mess things up," Issei muttered. Ria's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "You won't. And even if you do, we'll fix it together. You don't have to bear this burden alone." Issei looked at her, feeling a surge of warmth in his chest. Rias was always there for him, no matter what. And it wasn't just her, the whole group stood by him, even now when his powers posed a danger to everyone around him. He wasn't alone. He never had been. As they sat in silence, the air around them felt heavy again, but this time it wasn't the oppressive energy of destruction. It was something more intimate, more personal. Ria's proximity, her unwavering support, made Issei's heart race in a different way. "I've always admired you," Issei said quietly, his cheeks flushing slightly. "You're strong and smart, and you've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Rias blushed at his words, a soft smile spreading across her lips. "Issei." Before she could respond, the air around them suddenly shifted again, this time more violently. A surge of energy exploded from Issei's body without warning, a shockwave of destructive power radiating outward. Rias gasped as she was thrown back by the force, but Issei's heart sank as he saw the damage spreading across the field. "No!" Issei shouted, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to rein in the power, but it was like trying to hold back a flood. The energy kept pouring out, fueled by his emotions. Rias scrambled to her feet, calling out to the others for help. Akeno and Kiba rushed forward, erecting barriers to contain the blast, while Kaneko and Asia stood at the ready, their expressions filled with concern. "Issei, you need to calm down." Akeno shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm trying." Issei cried out, his hands shaking as he struggled to control the torrent of energy. But the more he fought it, the more it seemed to resist. Rias, despite the danger, pushed through the energy and grabbed Issei's arm. Her voice was firm, yet gentle. "Issei, look at me." Issei turned toward her, his eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Rias, I can't stop it." "You can," Rias said, her voice steady. "I'm right here with you. Focus on me." Issei's breathing slowed as he locked eyes with Rias. Her presence, her touch, calmed the storm inside him. The destructive energy that had been spiraling out of control began to recede, slowly but surely, until it was nothing more than a faint hum beneath his skin. The field was silent once more. Issei collapsed to his knees, exhausted from the effort. Rias knelt beside him, her arms around his shoulders. The rest of the group stood at a distance, watching with a mix of relief and apprehension. I almost lost control again, Issei muttered, his voice trembling. Riaz held him close, her hand gently stroking his hair. But you didn't. You brought it back. That's what matters. Issei leaned into her, grateful for her support, but the fear still lingered. He knew this was only the beginning. The power inside him was vast and dangerous. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the feeling that it was changing him. But for now, with Riaz by his side, he could hold on just a little longer. The morning sun had barely risen over Kuo Academy, casting long shadows across the Occult Research Club's training field. The air was crisp, but the tension among the group was palpable. Issei stood alone in the center of the field, breathing heavily, sweat trickling down his brow. His mind raced as he tried to control the tempest of destructive energy swirling inside him. Over the past few days, Issei had made some progress in controlling his newfound powers, but the cost of that control was becoming apparent. His emotions were now the key to his abilities, and the stronger his feelings, particularly rage, the more uncontrollable the power became. It was a dangerous feedback loop, one that threatened to consume him if he wasn't careful. Riaz, Akeno, Kiba, Kaneko, and Asia stood at a distance, watching him with concern. They had all noticed the change in Issei. He was more serious now, more focused but also more volatile. His usual easygoing, perverted nature seemed overshadowed by something darker, something that none of them had the power to stop if it got out of hand. Issei, are you ready to try again? Riaz called out, her voice steady but filled with worry. Issei nodded, but he didn't respond verbally. He could feel the destructive energy bubbling just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest trigger to erupt. This power was far different from anything he had ever experienced as a devil or even as the Red Dragon Emperor. It felt alive, almost sentient, like a beast lurking inside him, feeding off his emotions. Just stay calm, Issei Akeno added softly. Remember, you're in control. Issei closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push aside the anxiety gnawing at him. He focused on the energy, attempting to channel it through his hands in a controlled burst. But as soon as he called upon the power, something went wrong. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and his vision blurred. The energy flared wildly, far stronger than he intended. His control slipped. His heart raced, and a deep primal anger surged within him, an anger he didn't even understand. His mind clouded with thoughts of destruction, of tearing apart everything around him. No. Issei shouted, trying to rein it in, but it was too late. The power exploded outward in a violent surge, sending a shockwave through the air. The ground cracked beneath his feet, and a nearby tree was obliterated into splinters. The group barely had time to react. Riaz raised her hand, creating a barrier just in time to shield the others from the blast, but the damage was done. Issei collapsed to his knees, panting heavily, his body trembling from the exertion. I couldn't control it, Issei gasped, his voice filled with both frustration and fear. Riaz rushed to his side, her expression a mixture of concern and fear. Issei, you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest. I can't rest. Issei snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. He immediately regretted it when he saw the look on Ria's face, hurt, mixed with surprise. His heart sank. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. But Riaz just shook her head. It's okay. You're under a lot of pressure. Issei clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. He didn't want to hurt anyone, especially not his friends, but this power, it was like it had a mind of its own. The more he tried to control it, the more it fought back. And it scared him. Every time he used his powers, there was a part of him that enjoyed the destruction, that reveled in the chaos. It wasn't him, but it was there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. Let's stop for today, Kiba suggested, stepping forward cautiously. You've done enough, Issei. Issei shook his head, standing up. No. I have to get better at this. If I can't control it, if I lose control again, I could hurt someone. Asia, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, stepped forward, her gentle voice breaking through the tension. Issei, maybe we should take a break. You've been training non-stop for days. Issei looked at her, and for a moment, the anger and frustration faded. Asia's presence had always been calming to him. She was his first real friend, the one who had believed in him from the beginning. But even as he looked at her, the fear of hurting her clouded his mind. I'm fine, Asia, Issei said, forcing a smile. I just need to practice more. Riaz exchanged a worried glance with Akeno, but neither of them spoke. They knew Issei was pushing himself too hard, but they also knew that he wouldn't stop until he had full control over his powers. And they couldn't blame him. The stakes were too high. Okay, Asia said softly, though her eyes were filled with concern. But please, be careful. Issei nodded, trying to reassure her, but deep down, he wasn't sure if he could be careful anymore. The group decided to take a break from the intense training session, giving Issei a moment to collect himself. Asia, always the peacemaker, approached him with a soft smile, offering to spar with him using her healing powers as a way to practice control without causing too much destruction. Maybe if you focus on smaller bursts of power, it won't be as overwhelming, Asia suggested. Issei hesitated. Sparring with Asia. The idea terrified him. What if he lost control again? What if he hurt her? But her smile, so innocent and trusting, reassured him. He couldn't let her down. Okay, let's try it, Issei agreed, albeit reluctantly. The sparring match began. Issei tried to follow Asia's advice, focusing on small, controlled bursts of energy. For a while, it seemed to work. His attacks were weaker, more focused, and the destructive force was contained. But then, something went wrong. As Asia moved in to heal a wound Issei had accidentally inflicted on himself, she stepped too close. Issei's emotions, already frayed from the training, spiked. His fear of hurting her mixed with his frustration, and before he could stop it, a surge of destructive energy flared from his body. Asia, get back. Issei shouted, but it was too late. The energy lashed out, striking Asia with a burst of crimson light. She was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. No. Issei's heart stopped. He rushed to her side, panic gripping him like a vice. Asia. I didn't mean to. Rias and Akeno were there in an instant, both of them kneeling beside Asia. Ria's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. Asia's body glowed faintly as her healing magic tried to mend the damage, but Issei could see the pain in her eyes. She was hurt, and it was his fault. I'm so sorry, Issei whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to, I didn't. Asia, despite the pain, managed a weak smile. It's okay, Issei. I know you didn't mean to. But her words did nothing to soothe the guilt burning in Issei's chest. He had hurt her, Asia, the kindest, most gentle person he knew. And it wasn't just a mistake. It was his power. His inability to control it. The destructive energy inside him had lashed out without warning, fueled by his emotions, and he hadn't been able to stop it. Issei said softly, her hand resting on his shoulder. This is why we need to take it slow. You can't push yourself like this. Issei stood up, stepping back from Asia. His hands trembled as he stared at them, as if they belonged to someone else. I heard her. Akeno's eyes were filled with sympathy. It was an accident, Issei. But this is exactly why we've been worried. You're not ready to handle this power yet. Issei clenched his fists, the guilt twisting inside him like a knife. I can't handle it, can I? I'm too dangerous. No, you're not, Ria said firmly, stepping in front of him. You're just struggling right now. But we'll figure this out together. Issei shook his head, his voice hollow. What if I can't? What if I lose control again, and next time it's worse? Ria's expression softened, but she didn't have an answer. None of them did. That night, the atmosphere in the clubroom was heavy with tension. No one spoke much after the incident. Asia had recovered, thanks to her healing abilities, but the damage to Issei's confidence was evident. He sat in the corner, staring at his hands, lost in thought. Rias watched him from across the room, her heart aching for him. She had never seen Issei like this before, so withdrawn, so defeated. The Issei she knew was always full of life, always ready to charge into battle with a grin on his face. But now, he looked like a shadow of himself. He's slipping away, Akeno said quietly, standing beside Rias. This power is changing him. Rias nodded, her chest tight with worry. I know. But we can't give up on him. He's still Issei somewhere in there. But what if he can't control it? Akeno asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if he loses himself completely? Rias didn't answer. She didn't want to think about that possibility. Issei was their friend, their comrade. And more than that, he was special to her. She couldn't let him fall. But as she looked at him, sitting there in silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Issei glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. In that moment, Ria saw the pain, the fear, the doubt. He was struggling, and she didn't know how to help him. But she had to try. The days following Issei's accidental attack on Asia were strained, to say the least. The Occult Research Club had taken a step back from training, giving Issei space to process the weight of his powers and what they meant for him and for the people he cared about. The others were always close by, never leaving him alone for too long. Despite their efforts to support him, Issei felt the growing darkness inside him like a shadow creeping over his heart. His emotions, once a source of strength, were now a constant battle. He could feel it, the whisper of destruction, always there, always calling. The temptation to unleash it, to let it run free and consume everything in its path, was growing harder to resist. But amidst the chaos of his internal struggle, Issei found solace in the company of those closest to him. Rias, Akeno, and Asia were always by his side, their presence a lifeline that kept him tethered to the person he used to be. Yet, even in their company, the shadow inside him loomed, whispering in the quiet moments, testing his resolve. It was a warm evening at the Gremory mansion, and the group had gathered for a quiet night of relaxation. After days of intense training and emotional turmoil, Rias had insisted on taking a break. They were seated in one of the more comfortable lounges, the crackling of a nearby fireplace, the only sound breaking the silence. Issei sat between Riaz and Akeno on the plush couch, while Asia sat on a smaller chair across from them, her gentle smile bringing some warmth to the tense atmosphere. Issei said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "How are you feeling?" Issei looked up at her, his heart heavy. He didn't know how to answer. How could he explain the constant battle raging inside him? How could he tell her that every moment felt like a struggle to keep the darkness at bay? "I'm managing," he finally said, though his tone was far from convincing. Riaz frowned, her eyes searching his face for some sign of reassurance. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up, you know. We're here for you." Akeno, who had been quietly watching the exchange, placed a hand on Issei's arm, her touch light but reassuring. "Riaz is right, Issei. You've been carrying this burden on your own, but you don't have to. Let us help." Issei's chest tightened as he looked between them. Riaz, the woman who had given him a chance to live again, and Akeno, who had always been there to support him. The two women who had come to mean so much to him. And then there was Asia, his first real friend, always full of kindness and understanding. How could he tell them that the darkness inside him was growing stronger? That he feared what he might become? "I don't want to hurt any of you," Issei muttered, his voice barely audible. Asia's soft voice filled the room. "You won't hurt us, Issei. We know you're struggling, but we trust you. We always have." The sincerity in her words tugged at his heart. Asia had always been the one to see the best in him, no matter what. But as much as he wanted to believe her, the whisper of destruction in the back of his mind reminded him that his powers were dangerous and it would only take one moment of weakness for him to lose control. Riaz moved closer to Issei, her warmth comforting. "Issei, we've faced so many challenges together. This is just another one. We'll find a way to help you control your power. You're not alone in this." Issei's heart swelled at her words, and for a moment, the darkness inside him receded. He wanted to believe in Riaz, in her unwavering faith in him. But even as she spoke, he could feel the tension between them, the weight of the unspoken emotions that had been building for so long. And then there was Akeno. She had been quieter lately, more contemplative, but her presence had been a constant source of support for him. He had always known about the rivalry between her and Riaz, the unspoken competition for his affection. But now, in this moment of vulnerability, it felt more real than ever. Issei's heart was torn. He cared deeply for both Riaz and Akeno, but his feelings for them were complicated, especially now, with everything going on. The romantic triangle between them had only grown more intense, and he could feel the tension bubbling beneath the surface. A soft sigh escaped him as he leaned back into the couch, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "You guys, you've always been there for me, and I don't deserve that. I've caused so much trouble." Riaz leaned closer, her hand gently brushing against his. "You deserve it, Issei. You've done so much for all of us. Don't forget that." Her words sent a jolt of warmth through his chest. He turned to face her, and for a moment, everything else faded away, the chaos, the darkness, the destructive power. All he could see was Riaz, her deep blue eyes staring into his, filled with emotion. He felt the pull between them, the connection they had shared since the day she had resurrected him as her pawn. "Riaz, I..." Before he could finish, Riaz leaned in, closing the distance between them. Her lips brushed against his in a tender, heartfelt kiss, and Issei felt his heart skip a beat. The warmth of her touch, the softness of her lips, it was everything he had ever dreamed of. But even in that moment of intimacy, something stirred inside him. A flicker of energy, dark and powerful, began to build. The whisper of destruction returned, louder this time, more insistent. The kiss, which had started as a moment of solace, quickly became something else. Issei could feel the energy surging within him, growing stronger, feeding off his emotions. "Issei." Riaz pulled back slightly, her eyes widening as she sensed the shift in the air. The energy irradiating from Issei had changed. It was darker, more volatile. I don't know what's happening," Issei gasped, his hand clutching his chest. The power inside him was spiraling out of control, reacting to his emotions, to the intensity of the moment. He could feel it bubbling to the surface, threatening to explode. Riaz's eyes filled with worry. "Issei, you need to calm down. Focus. Don't let it take over." But it was too late. The destructive energy burst forth from Issei's body in a violent surge, sending a shockwave through the room. The fireplace flickered wildly, and the windows rattled as the energy pulsed outward. Riaz barely had time to raise a protective barrier around them, shielding the group from the worst of the blast. Akeno and Asia rushed to his side, their expressions filled with concern. "Issei." Akeno called out, her voice filled with alarm. Issei struggled to regain control, his body trembling from the force of the energy coursing through him. The whisper in his mind had grown louder, more insistent, urging him to embrace the destruction, to let it consume him. He could feel the temptation, the raw power at his fingertips. "No, I won't let it," Issei gritted his teeth, forcing himself to fight back. With every ounce of willpower he had, he pushed against the darkness, against the power that threatened to overwhelm him. Slowly, painfully, the energy began to recede. The room fell silent once more, the only sound the crackling of the fire and Issei's labored breathing. Rias, Akeno, and Asia were at his side in an instant, their hands gently touching him, reassuring him that they were still there. That they hadn't given up on him. "Issei, are you okay?" Asia's soft voice broke the silence. Issei nodded weakly, though his body felt drained. "Yeah, I think so." But as he sat there, surrounded by the people he cared about most, Issei couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The darkness inside him was growing stronger, feeding off his emotions. The kiss with Rias, the moment of intimacy they had only intensified the power, made it harder to control. And now, as he looked at Rias, he couldn't help but wonder if his love for her, for Akeno, for Asia, was only making things worse. Could love really counterbalance the power of destruction? Or was it only adding fuel to the fire? The thought lingered in the back of his mind as he sat there in the shadows, surrounded by the people he loved. He wanted to believe that love could save him, that it could be the key to controlling his power. But the whisper in his mind, the voice of destruction, told him otherwise. For now, he was still Issei Haidu. But for how much longer? The sky over Kuo Academy was darker than usual, the once familiar blue now tinged with ominous storm clouds. Issei had felt the shift in the atmosphere for days now, as if the very air around him carried the weight of eyes watching from afar. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Rias, ever the leader, had grown more vigilant. Her nightly meetings with her brother, Surziches, were becoming more frequent, though she didn't share many details with the group. But Issei didn't need her to say it. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. It wasn't long before they learned why. "Issei, there's something we need to talk about," Rias said one afternoon, pulling him aside in the clubroom. The others Akeno, Kiba, Kaneko, and Zenobia were busy preparing for their next training session, but even they were on edge. Issei furrowed his brow, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's going on?" Rias hesitated, her eyes scanning the room to ensure they were out of earshot. "You've drawn the attention of the pantheon." Issei blinked, confused. "The pantheon? You mean gods?" Rias nodded grimly. "Yes. Gods from both heaven and hell, and other realms too. They've been monitoring your progress since you became the god of destruction. And now they're concerned." "Concerned?" Issei frowned, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Why? I haven't done anything." "You haven't," Rias interrupted, her expression softening. "But your power, it's unpredictable. The destructive energy you possess threatens the balance between creation and destruction. Gods like Hades and others in the underworld see you as a wild card. They don't trust that you'll be able to control it." Issei's heart sank. The thought of gods watching him, plotting against him, it felt surreal. "So what? They're going to come after me?" Ria's silence was all the confirmation he needed. "They believe that eliminating you is the safest option," she said quietly. "If they see you as a threat, they won't hesitate." Issei felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over him. He hadn't asked for this power, yet now it seemed like the whole supernatural world was gunning for him. And worse, his friends could get caught in the crossfire. "I won't let them hurt you guys," Issei muttered, determination flashing in his eyes. "I'll find a way to stop them." "We'll stop them," Rias corrected, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You're not doing this alone, Issei." The threat from the pantheon wasn't an idle one. Within days, strange occurrences began happening around Kuo. It started with small disruptions, unexplained power outages, sudden shifts in the weather. But soon, the incidents became more targeted. It was Kaneko who noticed the first direct attack. The petite, silver-haired girl had been patrolling the academy grounds late one evening when she sensed an unfamiliar presence. Shadowy figures moved in the darkness, their auras tinged with divine power. "They were watching us," Kaneko reported the next morning, her expression as calm as ever, but with an edge of concern. "Gods, or at least their servants. I could feel it." "They're getting bolder," Zenobia added, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her sword. "We need to be ready for anything." Issei sat quietly as the group discussed their next steps, his mind racing. He had been training relentlessly, trying to gain better control of his powers, but now the stakes were higher than ever. If the gods from the pantheon were serious about eliminating him, then they wouldn't stop at sending spies. Direct confrontation seemed inevitable. And then there was the other issue, his internal struggle. The destructive energy inside him had become more difficult to manage with each passing day. The darker side of his power fed off his emotions, particularly his anger and fear. And now, with his friends in danger, those emotions were dangerously close to the surface. As the tension in the group grew, so did Issei's connections with Kaneko and Zenobia. Both girls had become invaluable to him during this time, offering their own unique forms of support. Kaneko, ever the stoic warrior, had taken it upon herself to be Issei's sparring partner. She wasn't as talkative as Ria's or Akeno, but her presence was calming, grounding him when his emotions threatened to spiral out of control. During their training sessions, Kaneko would often silently watch him, offering quiet guidance that helped him focus. "Control your breathing," Kaneko would say during their sessions, her calm demeanor contrasting with the intensity of their sparring. "Don't let your emotions take over." Her words, simple as they were, helped him more than she probably realized. There was something about Kaneko's steady presence that reminded Issei of the importance of balance, something he desperately needed as he fought to master his powers. Zenobia, on the other hand, was more direct in her approach. Having once been a warrior of the church, she understood the weight of carrying power and the burden of responsibility. She spent hours with Issei, helping him track down information on the gods who might be after him. "We need to know our enemies," Zenobia had said, her determination unwavering. "If we're going to protect everyone, we have to be prepared." Issei appreciated Zenobia's straightforward nature. She didn't sugarcoat things, and that made it easier for him to face the reality of his situation. The more they researched, the more they learned about the gods of the pantheon, particularly those from the underworld gods like Hades, who had long been known for his ruthlessness. One evening, after an exhausting day of training and research, Issei found himself alone with Kaneko and Zenobia. The others had gone off to rest, but the three of them remained, sitting together in the quiet of the clubroom. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," Kaneko said softly, breaking the silence. She looked up at him with her usual calm expression, but there was something different in her eyes, and understanding that ran deeper than words. "I know," Issei replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Zenobia leaned forward, her eyes serious. "You've always been the one to protect us, Issei. But now, we need to protect you. These gods, they're dangerous, but so are we." Issei couldn't help but smile at that. "Yeah, I guess we are." But even as they sat there, sharing in the quiet camaraderie, Issei could feel the darkness stirring inside him again. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to take over. The whisper in his mind had grown louder, more insistent, urging him toward destruction. The gods feared him because of his potential for chaos, and part of him understood why. The power inside him was immense, and if he let it loose there was no telling what would happen. The first real attack came that night. The air around Kuo Academy was charged with tension, the sky crackling with an energy that felt otherworldly. Issei had been on edge all day, sensing that something was coming, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The attack came without warning. Dark figures descended from the sky, their forms wreathed in divine power. Hades had sent his emissaries, and they were here to finish what they had started. Issei barely had time to react as the first wave hit. He felt the surge of destructive energy inside him flare to life, instinctively responding to the threat. The ground beneath his feet cracked and splintered as his power surged outward, meeting the attackers head-on. But even as he fought, Issei could feel the darkness inside him growing. The more he used his powers, the stronger the temptation became. The whisper in his mind urged him to let go, to unleash the full force of his destruction and annihilate everything in his path. "Issei." Kaneko's voice cut through the chaos, grounding him. "Focus." He nodded, forcing himself to rein in the destructive energy. But it wasn't easy. Every time he tried to control it, the darkness fought back. Zenobia was at his side, her sword flashing as she cut through the enemies with precision. "We need to push them back. There are too many of them." Issei gritted his teeth, fighting to maintain control. The gods were relentless, their power immense, but he couldn't afford to lose himself now. Not with his friends depending on him. With a roar, Issei unleashed a controlled blast of destructive energy, sending several of the gods flying. The effort left him drained, but he couldn't stop now. They had to keep fighting. As the battle raged on, Issei's mind raced. He could feel the fear of the gods, their desire to eliminate him before he became too powerful. But he couldn't let them win. He wouldn't let them take away everything he had fought for. Rias, Akeno, and the others arrived just in time to join the fight, their combined strength pushing back the enemy forces. But even as they fought, Issei knew that this was only the beginning. The gods wouldn't stop until they had destroyed him. And as the darkness inside him continued to grow, Issei couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could resist its call. The tension in the occult research club had reached an all-time high. Since the attack by Hades' emissaries, the atmosphere had been thick with unease, and the pressure on Issei had grown even heavier. Each day, the weight of his destructive powers seemed more unbearable. But more than that, something even more troubling had started to take root. Asia, his closest friend, was pulling away from him. It started subtly. Asia, the kind-hearted healer who had always believed in Issei's goodness, began to grow distant. She no longer smiled as brightly, and her soft reassurances, ones that had always brought Issei comfort, became fewer and far between. Issei could see the conflict in her eyes whenever they spoke, but she never voiced it. Issei had tried to brush it off at first. He told himself that Asia was just worried, like everyone else. But deep down, he knew that something had changed. Asia, the person who had always stood by his side, was beginning to lose faith in him and in the power that had been thrust upon him. One quiet afternoon, Issei found Asia alone in the club's garden, sitting on the edge of a stone fountain. The delicate sound of water trickling behind her should have been peaceful, but her expression was troubled. She didn't notice Issei approaching at first, lost in her thoughts. "Asia?" Issei's voice was soft as he called out to her. She flinched slightly at the sound of his voice, but quickly composed herself, turning to face him with a small smile. "Oh, Issei. I didn't hear you coming." There was a sadness in her eyes that cut through him like a blade. Issei sat beside her, his heart heavy with unspoken words. The silence between them stretched on, but he couldn't bear it any longer. "Asia, I can tell something's bothering you," Issei said gently. "You've been distant. If something's wrong, you can tell me." Asia bit her lip, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. She glanced away, her gaze fixating on the rippling water of the fountain. "I don't know how to say this, Issei." He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. The look on her face told him everything he needed to know. Whatever she was about to say wasn't going to be easy to hear. "I've always believed in you, Issei," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Ever since you saved me, I've known you were someone special. Someone good. But this power you have now, the power of destruction, it scares me." Issei's breath caught in his throat. He had feared this conversation, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "I know you don't want to hurt anyone," Asia continued, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. "But I've seen what happens when you lose control. I've felt it. And I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything's going to be okay." Asia, Issei's voice cracked as he reached out to her. "I'm doing everything I can to control it. I don't want to hurt you or anyone else. You know that." "I do," Asia whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what if one day, you can't control it? What if something happens and the Issei we know is gone?" The word struck him harder than any blow. Issei pulled his hand back, guilt and fear twisting inside him. The thought of losing himself to the destructive power terrified him, but the idea of losing Asia's faith in him was even worse. "I don't want to lose you, Asia," Issei said, his voice filled with raw emotion. "You're my closest friend. You've always been there for me, and I swear I won't let this power change who I am." Asia wiped away a stray tear, her expression softening. "I want to believe that, Issei. I really do. But it's hard. It's hard to watch you struggle like this, knowing that I can't do anything to help." "You help me just by being here," Issei replied, his voice shaking. "Please, don't give up on me." She didn't respond right away, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. Issei could feel the distance between them growing, even as they sat side by side. Later that night, Issei found himself tossing and turning in bed, haunted by Asia's words. The fear in her eyes, the doubt in her voice had echoed in his mind, feeding into the very darkness he was trying to suppress. Was she right to be afraid? Could he really protect her, protect all of them, without losing himself? He barely had time to contemplate further before the sudden ringing of his communication device pulled him from his thoughts. The urgent voice of Kiba filled the air, crackling with static. "Issei. We've got a situation. Asia's been taken." Issei's heart stopped. "What? By who?" "It's the gods. They sent another wave of emissaries. They've taken her as bait, Issei. They're using her to draw you out." The cold fury surged through Issei, his vision blurring with rage. The gods had made their move, and they had gone after Asia, the one person who had always been by his side. The one person who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. "I'm on my way," Issei growled, already moving before Kiba could respond. His destructive energy flared within him, burning hotter than ever. But this time, it wasn't a usual chaotic swirl of power. This time, it was focused, sharp. The gods had chosen a secluded forest on the outskirts of town as their battleground. Issei arrived in a flash, his heart pounding with fury. The air was thick with tension, the sky above dark and stormy. Several figures cloaked in divine energy stood at the ready, their intentions clear. At the center of the clearing was Asia, bound by chains of light, her eyes wide with fear. She struggled against her restraints, but the divine magic holding her was too strong. "Issei," she cried out as soon as she saw him. The sight of her trapped, helpless, ignited something inside him, a rage unlike anything he had ever felt before. The whisper of destruction in his mind grew louder, more insistent, feeding off his anger. "You're here, god of destruction," one of the gods sneered, stepping forward. "We've been waiting." Issei's fists clenched, his destructive aura flaring around him like a wildfire. "Let her go." "Oh, we will," the god replied, a cruel smile on his lips. "But first, you'll have to show us just how powerful you really are." They wanted him to lose control. They wanted him to unleash the full force of his destructive power, to prove that he was the threat they believed him to be. "Issei, don't." Asia cried, her voice trembling. "Don't let them turn you into a monster." Her words pierced through the rage, grounding him. Issei's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep the darkness at bay. He could feel the power surging inside him, begging to be released, but he wouldn't give in. Not like this. Not with Asia's life on the line. The gods attacked, their divine magic crackling through the air. Issei moved on instinct, dodging their strikes with precision. His mind was a storm of emotions, rage, fear, love all colliding as he fought to protect Asia without losing himself. He unleashed a controlled burst of destructive energy, blasting one of the gods back, but it took everything in him to keep the power contained. His emotions were pushing him to the edge, but he couldn't afford to let go. Not with Asia so close. One of the gods raised his hand, a spear of divine light forming in his grasp. Your time is up, god of destruction. The spear hurtled toward Issei, but before it could strike, Zenobia appeared, her sword flashing as she deflected the attack. Kiba and Riaz followed, joining the fight in a blur of motion. Issei, focus. Riaz shouted as she summoned her own magic to hold back the other gods. Issei's hands trembled as he watched the battle unfold. He could feel the destructive power clawing at him, desperate to be unleashed. But if he let it out, there was no guarantee that Asia or anyone would survive. Don't do it, Issei. Asia's voice echoed in his mind. Please don't become the monster they think you are. Tears welled in Issei's eyes as he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let the power control him. Not this time. With a roar of defiance, Issei charged forward, his fists glowing with destructive energy, but this time, he didn't let the darkness take over. He kept the power focused, precise, as he took down the remaining gods with controlled strikes. The battle was over in minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the last god fell, Issei rushed to Asia's side, his heart pounding with relief. He shattered the chains binding her, pulling her into a tight embrace. Are you okay? He whispered, his voice shaky. Asia nodded, tears streaming down her face. I was so scared, but I knew you wouldn't give in. Issei held her close, his own tears falling as he realized just how close he had come to losing everything. At night, as the group gathered to recover from the battle, Asia sat beside Issei, her faith in him fully restored. The doubts that had plagued her were gone, replaced by a renewed sense of trust. Issei had proven, not just to her but to himself, that he could control his powers. But as Issei sat there, surrounded by his friends, he knew that this was only one battle. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared, it had only been held at bay. The struggle would continue, but for now, he had his friends, and he had their faith. And that, for the moment, was enough. The ominous air of the underworld hung heavy as the Occult Research Club found themselves face to face with the greatest threat they had ever encountered. Hades, the god of the underworld. His dark throne stood high above the battlefield, his minions a terrifying army of the dead surrounding him like shadows. Issei's heart pounded as he stared into the abyss, feeling the familiar pull of his destructive powers, more potent than ever. This was it. The confrontation they had feared for weeks. Hades had grown tired of waiting, tired of watching Issei wrestle with his powers. Now, he had come to finish what he started, to eliminate the god of destruction before Issei could fully control his abilities. Issei Haidu. Hades' voice echoed through the desolate landscape, deep and rumbling like an earthquake. You are an abomination. Your existence threatens the balance of life and death. Today, you will fall. Issei's body trembled as the destructive energy inside him surged, responding to the provocation. His hands burned with crimson light, the raw power itching to be unleashed. But this time, it was different. The energy was wild, nearly uncontrollable, pressing against the boundaries of his mind. Every step he took toward Hades felt like walking closer to a precipice, the edge of something terrifying. I'm not going down that easily, Issei growled, though the darkness in his voice betrayed his growing fear. I've got people to protect. Behind him, Riaz, Akeno, Kaneko, Zenobia, and the rest of the Occult Research Club stood ready, but their expressions were filled with worry. They knew the stakes. If Issei lost control here, it wouldn't just be Hades who suffered the consequences. The destructive power he wielded could easily level the entire underworld. Hades let out a low, menacing laugh. People to protect? Foolish boy. You've already lost. The power inside you will consume everything, your friends, your world, even yourself. Why fight it? Issei's heart hammered in his chest, but Hades' words struck deep. Could he really protect them? Could he keep control of this power when even now, it was threatening to tear him apart from the inside? Issei, don't listen to him. Riaz called out, her voice urgent, cutting through the fog of doubt. You're stronger than this. But even as she spoke, the destructive energy continued to build, pressing against the limits of Issei's control. His body felt like it was on fire, the power clawing at his skin, begging to be released. He gritted his teeth, his fists clenching as he tried to suppress it. Hades raised his hand, and with a wave, his army of undead minions surged forward. The ground shook as they charged, their eyes glowing with dark energy. Riaz. Akeno. Issei shouted, his voice strained. Go after Hades. I'll hold off the minions. Rias hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes. Issei, you can't. Oh. Issei barked, his eyes glowing with crimson power. I can handle this. With a reluctant nod, Rias and Akeno moved toward Hades, their magical auras flaring as they prepared for battle. But even as they left his side, Issei knew that he wasn't just fighting the undead army. He was fighting himself. The minions closed in, and Issei didn't hesitate. With a roar, he unleashed a wave of destructive energy that tore through the ranks of the undead like a tidal wave, disintegrating everything in its path. The ground cracked beneath him, the air crackling with energy. But the more he fought, the stronger the pull of destruction became. The power was exhilarating, intoxicating. He could feel it flowing through him, consuming him. Every punch, every burst of energy felt like giving in to the darkness, and yet, he couldn't stop. The power was too much, too overwhelming. I can't, Issei muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't control it. His vision blurred as the destructive energy surged again, this time even more violently. His body glowed with a dark crimson light, and the ground beneath him began to fracture, splitting apart under the weight of his power. The minions disintegrated before him, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the hunger of destruction inside him. Across the battlefield, Rias and Akeno fought valiantly against Hades, their combined magic clashing with the god's overwhelming power. But even as they fought, they couldn't help but glance back at Issei, their hearts heavy with worry. The battlefield was a chaotic mess of energy and destruction, but the real battle was happening inside Issei. Issei. Rias shouted, her voice desperate. Don't give in. But Issei could barely hear her. The whisper of destruction had grown into a deafening roar inside his mind, drowning out everything else. His body felt like it was being torn apart by the energy, and yet, it wasn't enough. The power wanted more. With a scream of agony, Issei unleashed another burst of energy, this one even larger than before. The shockwave ripped through the battlefield, sending debris flying and forcing Rias and Akeno to throw up barriers to protect themselves. Issei, stop. Akeno cried out, her voice filled with desperation. But Issei couldn't stop. The power had taken hold of him, and he was losing the battle to keep it contained. His body trembled, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The ground beneath him crumbled as the destructive energy consumed everything in its path. Hades watched from his throne, a sinister smile spreading across his face. Yes, let it consume you, boy. This is your true nature. Issei fell to his knees, his body shaking as the energy spiraled out of control. He could feel himself slipping away, losing the part of himself that was still human. The darkness was taking over, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And then, through the chaos, he heard her voice. Issei. Rias called out, her voice cutting through the storm of destruction. Look at me. Through the haze of power, Issei's eyes found Rias. She was standing just a few feet away, her barrier shimmering as it held back the destructive energy swirling around them. Her eyes were filled with fear, but also something else, love. The same love that had always been there, the love that had saved him so many times before. You're stronger than this, Rias said, her voice trembling. You're not just the god of destruction. You're Issei Haidu. You're the person who saved all of us. You're the person I love. Issei's heart clenched at her words, the truth of them cutting through the darkness like a beacon of light. He wasn't just a force of destruction. He was Issei. He was more than the power inside him. He was someone who loved and cared for his friends, someone who had a reason to fight beyond the chaos. Rias, Issei whispered, his voice weak but determined. Slowly, he forced himself to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. The destructive energy still roared inside him, but he pushed back against it, focusing on Rias, on her love, her faith in him. I'm not going to let this power control me, Issei growled, his fists clenching. I'm still me. With a roar of defiance, Issei summoned every ounce of willpower he had left. The destructive energy surged again, but this time, he didn't let it consume him. Instead, he channeled it, focused it. The crimson light surrounding him began to dim, the ground beneath him stabilizing as the power receded. Rias stepped forward, her heart pounding as she watched him regain control. She reached out to him, her hand gently touching his cheek. You're okay, Issei. You're okay. Issei let out a shaky breath, his body trembling as the last of the destructive energy faded away. His eyes met Rias, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the storm inside him quieted. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice filled with regret. You don't have to be sorry, Rias replied softly, her eyes shining with emotion. You fought through it. You won. Issei's heart swelled with relief, but before he could respond, a shadow loomed over them. Hades, furious at the turn of events, raised his hand, dark energy crackling in his palm. This isn't over, boy, Hades snarled. You may have control now, but you will always be a threat. And threats must be eliminated. Issei's body tensed, but this time, he wasn't alone. Rias, Akeno, and the rest of the occult research club stood beside him, their combined strength shining like a beacon of hope. I'm not alone, Hades, Issei said, his voice steady. And I'm not giving in to this power. Not today, not ever. But the final burst of power, this one controlled and precise Issei and his friends launched their combined attack at Hades. The god of the underworld roared in fury as the energy collided with him, engulfing him in light. When the smoke cleared, Hades was gone, his army of minions scattered. The battle was over. Later, as the group stood together in the aftermath of the battle, Issei finally allowed himself to breathe. The weight of the power inside him was still there, but it didn't feel as overwhelming anymore. For the first time, he felt like he could handle it because he wasn't fighting alone. Rhea stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his. You did it, Issei. You controlled it. Issei smiled, his heart full of gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you. And as they walked away from the battlefield, Issei knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the struggle with his powers wasn't over. But with his friends by his side and with the love he had for them, he knew that he could face whatever came next. The victory against Hades should have brought relief to Issei and his friends, but the weight of his power continued to linger in the air like a shadow. Days passed, and though the threat from the underworld had been vanquished, Issei found no peace. The battle had proven his ability to control his destructive power, but it also left him vulnerable to a new danger, a darker temptation that now loomed over him. It began subtly at first, creeping into the edges of his mind like a whisper in the dead of night. The voice, smooth and seductive, spoke of greater strength, of a power beyond what Issei had tapped into. It promised him the ability to protect those he loved, to eliminate any threat before it could reach them. But with each passing day, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, tempting him to let go of the limitations he had placed on himself. Why hold back? The voice would ask, its tone oozing with temptation. You've seen what you're capable of, Issei. Think of the things you could accomplish with true power. No one would ever harm your friends again. No one would ever stand in your way. Issei tried to ignore it, to push the voice aside, but the temptation had rooted itself in his mind. He could feel it every time he used his powers, the promise of ultimate control beckoning him, just out of reach. And the more he resisted, the stronger the voice became. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Issei found himself alone in the courtyard of the Grimoire mansion. The others had retreated inside to rest, but he stayed behind, trying to clear his mind. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the garden, but even its light felt dim compared to the growing darkness within him. Issei sat on a stone bench, his thoughts whirling like a storm. The temptation had grown stronger that day, and he could still hear the voice echoing in his mind, urging him to give in. Issei? The soft voice of Rhea's cut through his thoughts, and he looked up to see her standing a few feet away. Her long crimson hair flowed down her back, and her deep blue eyes were filled with concern. She had been worried about him since the battle, sensing the inner conflict he had been struggling with. You've been quiet lately, Rhea said as she approached, her voice gentle but tinged with worry. You're not yourself. Issei forced a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm fine, Rhea's. Just tired, I guess. Rhea's frowned, clearly unconvinced. She sat beside him, her presence warm and comforting, but Issei could feel the tension between them. He had been pulling away from her, not intentionally, but because of the voice. It was hard to explain, but the more the temptation grew, the more distant he felt from the people he cared about. You've been avoiding me, Rhea said softly, her hand resting gently on his arm. I know something's wrong, Issei. Please, talk to me. Issei hesitated, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had been hiding. He wanted to tell her, wanted to let her in, but the voice in his head whispered that she wouldn't understand. That she would be afraid of what he was becoming. I don't know how to explain it, Issei admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ever since the battle, I've been hearing this voice. It's like it's trying to get me to use my powers. To let go of everything and just give in. Rhea's eyes widened in alarm. A voice? What do you mean? Issei shook his head, frustrated with himself for not being able to articulate it. It's the power of destruction. It's trying to pull me in, Rhea's. Every time I use it, I can feel it getting stronger, like it's trying to take control. And part of me wants to let it. No, Rhea said firmly, her grip on his arm tightening. You can't let it, Issei. You're stronger than this. Issei looked at her, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. What if I'm not? What if I can't fight it? Rhea's opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She had always been the one to believe in him, to reassure him when he doubted himself. But now, there was a flicker of doubt in her gaze, doubt that terrified him. Issei, you've come so far, Rhea said quietly, her voice trembling. I can't lose you to this power. I won't. Her words pierced through him, and for a moment, the temptation seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of her love. But even as Rhea spoke, the shadowy figure in his mind reappeared, darker and more menacing than before. Issei, the voice whispered, more seductive than ever. She doesn't understand. None of them do. But you could be so much more. You could protect her from anything. All you have to do is embrace the power. Issei clenched his fists, his heart racing as he struggled against the pull of the voice. But the temptation was becoming harder to resist. The promise of ultimate power, of never having to fear for his friends again, was intoxicating. Issei. Ria's voice was soft, but it cut through the haze of temptation. He looked at her, his heart heavy with guilt. I'm trying, Riaz. I'm trying so hard, but… Before he could finish, Riaz stood abruptly, her expression pained. I can't do this, Issei. I can't watch you fall into this darkness. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Issei alone in the moonlit courtyard. He watched her go, his heart sinking as he realized just how close he was to losing her. The temptation had driven a wedge between them, and now, he wasn't sure if he could ever repair it. Later that night, Issei found himself wandering the mansion's hallways, his mind in turmoil. The voice in his head had grown louder, more insistent, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push it away. Issei. He stopped in his tracks, startled by the sound of Akeno's voice. She stood in the doorway of one of the rooms, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her violet eyes filled with understanding. I've been looking for you, Akeno said softly, stepping toward him. I had a feeling you might need someone to talk to. Issei's shoulders sagged, the weight of the temptation pressing down on him. Akeno, I don't know what to do. Akeno's expression softened as she reached out to him, her hand gently resting on his arm. I know you're struggling, Issei. I can see it in your eyes. But you're not alone in this. You don't have to fight it by yourself. Issei looked at her, his heart heavy with doubt. What if I can't fight it? What if this power takes over? Akeno's hand slid down to his, her touch warm and reassuring. You're stronger than you think, Issei. I've seen you face impossible odds before and you always come out on top. This is no different. Issei let out a shaky breath, the weight of his emotions crashing down on him. I don't want to hurt anyone. You won't, Akeno said firmly, her eyes locking with his. Because you're not the kind of person who gives in to darkness. You've got too much heart for that. There was something in the way Akeno spoke, something in her voice that made Issei believe her. She had always been able to see through him, to understand him in ways that few others did. And in this moment, he needed her more than ever. Without thinking, Issei stepped closer to Akeno, his heart pounding as he felt the warmth of her presence. The tension between them had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, but now, it felt more intense than ever. Akeno, Issei whispered, his voice filled with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but full of unspoken understanding. I'm here, Issei. Always. In that moment, the temptation faded into the background, replaced by something deeper, something real. Issei leaned in, his lips brushing against Akeno's in a tender, heartfelt kiss. The world seemed too still around them, and for the first time in days, the shadow of destruction felt far away. When they pulled apart, Akeno smiled softly, her hand resting on his cheek. You don't have to face this alone. You've got all of us, Riaz, Asia and me. We'll help you fight it. Issei's heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could resist the dark temptation inside him. Not because of his own strength, but because of the love and support of the people who stood by him. Later that night, as Issei lay in bed, his mind drifted back to the voice, to the temptation that had plagued him. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to give in. But now, it felt weaker. The darkness wasn't as overwhelming as it had been before. Issei closed his eyes, focusing on the love he had for his friends, for Riaz and Akeno. That love was his anchor, the thing that kept him grounded. And as long as he had them, he knew he could fight the temptation. But deep down, he also knew that the battle wasn't over. The darkness was still there, waiting. And it would take everything he had to keep resisting. The days following Issei's struggle with the dark temptation passed in a tense, uneasy silence. The victory against Hades had given them a brief respite, but it was only that, a momentary pause before the next wave of enemies. There were whispers in the underworld, rumors of gods and entities regrouping, forming alliances to take down the god of destruction. And now, with Hades gone, the true threats were preparing for their final assault. The Occult Research Club was on high alert. Riaz, always the strategic leader, had begun mobilizing her allies in the underworld and the human world. But as the storm gathered on the horizon, there was a grim understanding that this battle would be unlike any they had faced before. Issei was their strongest asset, but he was also their greatest risk. Inside the Gremory mansion, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one dared to speak of it. The unspoken fear hung in the air like a heavy fog, threatening to suffocate them. Issei, meanwhile, could feel the weight of his powers more acutely than ever. Every day, the control he had fought so hard to maintain felt more fragile, like a dam waiting to break. His emotions were the key to his strength, but they were also his greatest weakness. One slip, one moment of anger or fear, and everything could unravel. In the center of the mansion, the members of the occult research club gathered around a long table, maps and scrolls spread out before them. Rhea stood at the head, her expression grim but focused as she outlined their plans for the coming battle. The room was silent, save for the soft flickering of candlelight and the occasional rustle of paper. "We've received word that several factions are preparing to strike," Rhea said, her voice steady. "There are gods from both heaven and hell who want to see Issei fall. They're uniting, and they'll come at us with everything they have." Thibault leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Do we know when they'll attack?" Rhea shook her head. "Not yet, but it won't be long. They're waiting for the right moment when Issei is at his weakest." Issei, who had been standing near the back of the room, clenched his fists. He hated feeling like a liability. Every time his powers surged, every time he came close to losing control, he could see the fear in his friend's eyes. They trusted him, but the question lingered: how much longer could he hold on? "We need to be ready for anything," Rhea continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This isn't just about protecting Issei. This is about protecting everything we've built, everything we care about. If they break through, it won't just be us who suffer." There was a heavy silence as her words sank in. They all knew the stakes, but hearing them out loud made it real. Haneko, ever the calm and observant one, glanced over at Issei. "What about Issei's power? How do we make sure he doesn't lose control during the fight?" Rhea's gaze shifted to Issei, her eyes filled with concern. "That's why we need to stay close to him. Issei's emotional state is going to be crucial. If he loses himself, we'll all be in danger." The word stung, but Issei knew she was right. The power of destruction wasn't something he could control with brute force or sheer willpower. It was tied to his emotions, his heart. And that was what made it so dangerous. Issei took a deep breath, stepping forward. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice firm. "I know what's at stake. I'm not going to let my powers hurt any of you." Rhea's nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a doubt that mirrored the one gnawing at Issei's own heart. As the meeting concluded, the others began preparing for the inevitable battle, each retreating to their own tasks. But Rhea's remained behind, her gaze following Issei as he moved toward one of the large windows overlooking the garden. The night sky was dark, clouds swirling ominously as if reflecting the tension in the air. "Issei," Rhea called softly, walking toward him. He turned to face her, his expression troubled. "I know what you're going to say, Rhea. You don't have to." Rhea shook her head, her crimson hair flowing around her like a cascade of fire. "Yes, I do. You've been carrying this burden alone for too long." Issei looked away, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm supposed to be the one protecting all of you. But now it feels like I'm the one who needs protecting." "You're not a burden," Rhea said, stepping closer. "You've always been the one we could count on. But this power, it's too much for anyone to handle alone." Issei's heart ached as he heard the concern in her voice. He had always tried to be strong, for her, for their friends. But the truth was, the weight of the god of destruction's power was suffocating him, slowly chipping away at who he was. "I'm scared," Issei admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I lose control? What if I end up hurting you?" Rhea's reached out, her hand gently resting on his cheek. The warmth of her touch sent a shiver through him, and for a moment, the fear seemed to fade. "You won't," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You're stronger than you think, Issei. And I'm not going to let you fall." Issei's breath caught in his throat as he looked into her eyes. The love and determination he saw there were overwhelming, and he felt something inside him shift. For so long, he had been trying to carry this burden on his own, but now he realized he didn't have to. "Rhea's," Issei started, his voice faltering. But Rhea's cut him off, her lips pressing softly against his in a kiss that was tender and full of emotion. Issei's heart swelled as he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer. The world around them seemed to disappear, the tension, the fear, all of it faded in the warmth of their embrace. When they finally pulled apart, Rhea's rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed as she whispered, "I love you, Issei. I've always loved you." Issei's heart skipped a beat. He had always known there was something between them, but hearing her say the words filled him with a new sense of purpose, a new strength he hadn't realized he had. "I love you too," Issei whispered, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Not now, not ever." They stood there in the silence of the night, holding each other close as the storm gathered on the horizon. The world around them was preparing for war, but in that moment, all that mattered was the bond between them, the love that had always been there, even when the darkness threatened to tear them apart. The next day, the occult research club prepared for what would likely be their final stand. The sky was dark, swirling with ominous clouds that mirrored the storm brewing in the supernatural world. Reports had come in from their allies. Hades's forces were regrouping, joined by rogue gods from both heaven and hell, determined to bring Issei down. As Issei stood on the battlefield, surrounded by his friends, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The temptation of ultimate power still lingered in the back of his mind, but it no longer held the same sway over him. Ria's love, the bond he shared with his friends, it was stronger than the darkness inside him. "Are you ready?" Ria's asked, standing beside him, her hand brushing against his. Issei nodded, his eyes focused on the horizon. "I'm ready." The others gathered around the Mikeno, Kiba, Kaneko, Zenobia, and Asia, all of them prepared to fight for their lives, for their world. They had faced countless battles together, but this one felt different. This time, the stakes were higher than ever. As the storm clouds gathered overhead, the first wave of enemies appeared on the horizon. Hades's forces, joined by gods who sought to either kill Issei or force him to embrace his role as the god of destruction. But Issei was ready. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. With a deep breath, Issei felt the destructive power inside him flare to life, but this time, it wasn't wild or uncontrollable. It was focused, steady, a reflection of the strength he had found in the people who stood by his side. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time, Issei wasn't afraid. The battlefield was an expanse of shattered earth and swirling clouds, the sky dark with impending chaos. Lightning streaked across the heavens, casting jagged shadows over the opposing armies. On one side stood the coalition of gods, beings from both heaven and hell, their divine auras crackling with untold power. And on the other side, Issei Haidu, flanked by his friends, the Occult Research Club, stood ready to face the storm that threatened to consume them all. Issei could feel the weight of their eyes on him, gods of wrath and judgment, each one seeking his destruction. Their intentions were clear. Either he would embrace his role as the god of destruction and become a force beyond their control, or they would destroy him before he reached his full potential. The ground beneath his feet trembled as they approached, the sheer magnitude of their presence bearing down on him like an unstoppable force. But it wasn't just the gods Issei had to face. The darkness within him, the temptation of absolute power, still whispered in the back of his mind. It was stronger than ever now, seducing him with promises of victory, of control, of protection for the people he loved. The voice was no longer just a whisper, it was a roaring presence, pushing him toward the edge. "Divin, Issei," the voice urged, a cold, seductive tone weaving through his thoughts. "Embrace the power. End this war in an instant. Crush your enemies, and no one will ever threaten you again." Issei clenched his fists, his heart racing. He had fought this battle before, but never on this scale. The temptation was overwhelming, almost too much to bear. And yet, as he stood there, his friends by his side, he knew what was at stake. If he gave in, if he let the darkness consume him, he would lose everything: Ria's, Akeno, Kaneko, Zenobia, Asia, all of them. He couldn't let that happen. "They're coming," Ria said, her voice calm but filled with tension. She stood close to him, her aura flaring with the power of her bloodline. "We'll face them together, Issei. No matter what." Issei looked at her, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. Ria's had always been his anchor, his guide. And now, in this final battle, she was his strength. "I won't let them take me," Issei said, his voice firm. "I won't let the darkness win." Ria smiled, her hand brushing lightly against his. "I believe in you." The first strike came from the gods, massive blasts of divine energy hurtling through the air toward Issei and his friends. The ground shook as the attacks landed, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. But the Occult Research Club was ready. Kiba darted forward with lightning speed, his sword flashing as he deflected the incoming blows, while Akeno called down her own storm of lightning to counter the divine onslaught. Issei felt the surge of destructive energy within him respond to the attacks, but he held it back, focusing on controlled bursts of power to protect his friends. His body glowed with a familiar crimson aura, but this time, it wasn't wild or chaotic. He had learned to harness it, to direct it with purpose. The battle raged on, gods clashing with devils, lightning crackling in the air as divine and demonic forces collided. Kaneko and Zenobia fought alongside each other, their movements a blur as they took down enemy after enemy. Asia stood back, her healing magic at the ready, watching Issei with a mixture of hope and fear. But as the battle wore on, the temptation inside Issei grew stronger. Each time he unleashed his power, he could feel the darkness creeping closer, urging him to let go, to unleash the full extent of his abilities. The gods were relentless, their attacks growing more vicious, more desperate. "You can end this now," the voice whispered in his mind, colder than ever. All it would take is one moment. One surge of power, and they would fall. Issei gritted his teeth, fighting against the pull of the voice. He could feel the power pressing against his control, like a dam threatening to burst. His heart raced as the battle around him intensified, the gods closing in from all sides. A towering figure, one of the gods of war, stepped forward, his eyes burning with divine fury. "You can't fight what you are, boy. You were born for destruction. It's your destiny." The words hit Issei like a punch to the gut. He had always feared that this power would define him, that no matter how hard he tried, he would never escape the shadow of the god of destruction. But then, through the chaos, he heard Ria's voice. You're more than that, Issei. You're more than this power. Issei turned to see Ria standing a few feet away, her hands raised as she summoned a wave of crimson magic to block an incoming attack. Her eyes met his, filled with determination and love. You're not just a weapon, Ria shouted, her voice cutting through the noise of battle. You're Issei Haidu, and you've always been more than your power. Her words pierced through the fog of temptation, cutting through the darkness that had been trying to consume him. Issei felt a surge of clarity, a reminder of who he really was. He wasn't just a vessel for destruction. He was a friend, a comrade, and someone who loved and cared deeply for the people around him. The god's attacks intensified, and Issei knew he had to make a choice. He could feel the destructive energy swelling inside him, begging to be released. He could end this battle in an instant, crush his enemies with a single blow. But at what cost? Issei closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He could feel the presence of his friends around him, their strength, their loyalty. He could feel Ria's love, a constant force that had always been with him, even in his darkest moments. When he opened his eyes, the darkness inside him began to recede. The voice that had once been so loud, so tempting, grew quieter, fading into the background. I'm not a god of destruction, Issei whispered to himself, his fists glowing with controlled energy. I'm Issei Haidu. And I'm going to protect the people I love. With a roar of defiance, Issei unleashed a surge of power, not the wild, uncontrollable force of destruction, but a focused, precise burst of energy that radiated with his own strength. The ground shook as the energy collided with the god's attacks, but this time, Issei was in control. The gods staggered back, their divine power wavering as Issei's strength pushed them to their limits. They had expected him to fall, to succumb to the darkness within him. But Issei had chosen a different path. You're not going to win, Issei said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. Because I'm not fighting alone. As if on cue, Riaz and the others rallied behind him, their combined strength forming a shield of unity and determination. Akeno summoned a massive storm, lightning crashing down upon the gods, while Kiba and Zenobia charged forward, their swords blazing with energy. The gods, realizing they were outmatched, began to retreat, their confidence shattered by the strength of Issei and his friends. One by one, they disappeared into the shadows, their power fading from the battlefield. And then, it was over. The battlefield fell silent, the storm clouds above slowly dissipating as the gods retreated. Issei stood at the center of it all, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his heart filled with a sense of peace. He had made his choice. As the dust settled, Riaz walked over to Issei, her eyes shining with pride. You did it, she said softly. Issei smiled, though he was still catching his breath. I couldn't have done it without you. Riaz placed her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle and warm. You've always been more than this power, Issei. You've always been someone who fights with his heart. Issei's heart swelled with emotion, and he pulled Riaz into a tight embrace. The weight of the battle, the temptation, the fear, it all melted away in her arms. He had faced the darkness within himself and chosen love, friendship, and loyalty over power. As he held Riaz, Issei knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The temptation would always be there, the power of destruction lurking in the background. But now, he had something stronger to hold on to: his love for his friends, his connection to Riaz, and his determination to remain true to himself. And that, Issei realized, was all the strength he would ever need. The sun rose gently over Kuo, casting a warm golden light that spilled through the windows of the Occult Research Club's mansion. The world felt different, calmer, lighter, as if the battle that had raged just days ago was now a distant memory. Issei stood in the garden, his hands resting on the cool stone of the fountain, reflecting on the events that had nearly torn his life apart. The weight of his destructive power still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was a part of him, yes, but he had made peace with it. The gods had retreated, defeated not just by his power, but by his will to remain true to himself. Issei had faced his own darkness, the temptation to let his destructive power consume him, and in the end, he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to be both protector and destroyer, to wield his power with purpose, not recklessness. It wasn't about denying the darkness, it was about balancing it with light. As he stood there, the cool morning breeze brushing against his skin, he felt a presence behind him. You're thinking too much again, Riaz said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of familiarity and affection. Issei turned to see her standing just a few feet away, the soft sunlight catching the vibrant red of her hair, making it glow like fire. Her eyes, those deep beautiful eyes, were filled with warmth as she looked at him. It was a look that told him he wasn't alone in this, he never had been. Can you blame me? Issei replied, smiling softly. A lot's happened. Riaz stepped closer, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. I know. But we made it through. Together. Issei nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. Riaz had always been his anchor, the person who believed in him when no one else did. And now, after everything, he knew that his feelings for her were stronger than ever. I couldn't have done it without you, Issei admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. You've always been there for me, Riaz. Even when I didn't deserve it. Riaz shook her head, her hand sliding down to intertwine with his. You've always deserved it, Issei. From the very beginning, I knew you were different. You're not just the god of destruction. You're the person who fights for the people he loves. That's who you've always been. Issei's heart raced as he looked into her eyes. He had faced so much over the past few weeks, gods, enemies, and even his own inner demons, but standing here with Riaz, all of that faded away. There was only her, the woman who had saved him, the woman he had come to love more than anything. Riaz, Issei said, his voice barely a whisper. I love you. Riaz's eyes softened, a smile spreading across her lips as she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I love you too, Issei. I've always loved you. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, their lips met in a gentle, tender kiss. It was a kiss that carried with it the weight of all the battles they had fought, the struggles they had faced, and the love that had grown between them through it all. In that moment, nothing else mattered, only the connection they shared, the bond that had been forged in both fire and light. When they finally pulled apart, Riaz rested her forehead against Issei's, her eyes closed as she whispered, we'll face whatever comes next together. I promise. Issei smiled, his heart full. Together. As the day unfolded, the members of the Occult Research Club gathered in the mansion's common room, their spirits high after the victory. Kiba and Zenobia were sparring outside, their playful banter drifting in through the open windows, while Kaneko sat quietly with Asia, the two of them sharing tea and chatting about lighter topics, now that the tension had finally eased. Issei sat with Akeno in the living room, the two of them enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. It felt surreal, almost, to sit here in the quiet after all that had happened. But even as they relaxed, Issei couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unresolved between him and Akeno. He glanced over at her, watching as she smiled softly to herself, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her teacup. Akeno had always been there for him, too, her playful nature hiding a depth of emotion that he hadn't fully understood until now. She had supported him, stood by his side, and, in many ways, understood him in ways that others didn't. Akeno, Issei said softly, drawing her attention. She looked up, her violet eyes meeting his with a knowing expression. I know what you're going to say. Issei sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want things to be awkward between us. Akeno smiled, her expression gentle but filled with understanding. Issei, you don't have to worry about that. I've always known how you felt about Riaz. I've known from the beginning. Issei frowned, guilt gnawing at him. But you. Akeno shook her head, cutting him off. It's okay. Really. I love you, Issei, but I've accepted that your heart belongs to Riaz. And honestly, I'm happy for you both. Issei's heart ached as he looked at her. He had always cared deeply for Akeno, and he hated the thought of causing her pain. But the warmth in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice, told him that she wasn't hurt, at least, not in the way he had feared. Akeno set her cup down and leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a soft, almost teasing tone. Besides, who says there isn't room for more than one person in your heart? Issei blinked, his face turning red as Akeno laughed, her playful nature shining through once again. But even in her teasing, there was a sense of closure and understanding that, while things were complicated, they would be okay. The love triangle that had once caused so much tension between them had finally found its resolution. Akeno leaned back, her smile softening as she added, you're always going to be special to me, Issei. And I'm always going to be here for you, no matter what. Issei smiled, grateful for her words. Thank you, Akeno. I'll always care about you, too. You know that, right? Akeno nodded, her eyes twinkling with affection. I know. And that's enough for me. The two of them sat in comfortable silence after that, the unspoken understanding between them solidifying the bond they had always shared. There was no bitterness, no regret, only acceptance and the promise of a continued friendship that would always be there, even if the nature of their relationship had changed. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Kuo, Issei stood on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the horizon. The world felt peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Issei felt a sense of calm. Riaz joined him on the balcony, her presence as comforting as ever. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood together, watching the sky change from gold to deep purple as the day gave way to night. We've come a long way, haven't we? Riaz mused, her voice soft. Issei nodded, his heart swelling with pride and love. Yeah, we have. There was a quiet moment between them before Riaz turned to face him, her eyes filled with warmth. What happens now? What do you want to do next, Issei? Issei smiled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon once more. I want to live. I want to protect the people I care about, and I want to keep growing. I'm not just the god of destruction anymore. I'm more than that. Riaz squeezed his hand gently. You've always been more than that. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Issei looked at her, his heart full of love and gratitude. Together, he echoed, his voice filled with certainty. And as they stood there, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, Issei knew that a new chapter in his life had begun. The battles they had fought, the struggles they had faced, they had all led him to this moment. A moment of peace, of love, and of hope for the future. He was Issei Haidu, the boy who had been given the power to destroy, but who had chosen to protect. And with Rias by his side, with his friends supporting him, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same determination and heart that had carried him this far. This was his new dawn, and it was only the beginning. The days following the final battle were calm, almost deceptively so. Kuo had returned to its usual tranquility, and the supernatural forces that had once threatened Issei and his friends had fallen silent. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. But for Issei Haidu, there was no longer any doubt or hesitation. He had faced the darkness within him, confronted the forces that sought to destroy him, and emerged not as a god of destruction, but as something far greater. Issei stood on the roof of the Occult Research Club's mansion, the warm breeze tousling his hair as he gazed out over the town. His heart was calm, his mind clear. The once overwhelming power of destruction still pulsed within him, but now it felt like a quiet hum, no longer threatening to spiral out of control. It was part of him, a force he could summon when needed, but no longer the driving force behind his every action. He smiled to himself, feeling the familiar warmth of the sun on his skin. For the first time in a long time, he felt peaceful. Footsteps echoed behind him, and he turned to see Rias approaching, her crimson hair glowing in the golden light of the setting sun. She smiled softly as she came to stand beside him, her presence as comforting as ever. Lost in thought again? Rias teased gently. Issei chuckled. Yeah, I guess I am. It's weird, you know. After everything that's happened, it feels like the calm after the storm. Rias nodded, her gaze drifting out over the horizon. It is calm, but it's the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've made it through the worst of it. You've come so far, Issei. Issei looked at her, his heart swelling with love. I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you. Rias turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth and affection. You never had to do it alone. That's what you've always needed to remember. You've always had us, and you always will. Issei smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle in his heart. He had spent so much time trying to carry the weight of his power on his own, fearing that it would consume him and hurt those he loved. But now, after everything, he realized that the key to controlling his power wasn't in denying it or fighting it was in accepting it and accepting the love and support of the people around him. He was no longer just the god of destruction. He was Issei Haidu, protector of his friends, a lover, a fighter, and someone who would do anything to protect the people he cared about. That evening, the Occult Research Club gathered in the mansion's common room for a quiet celebration. It wasn't a grand event, just the six of them sitting together, sharing stories and laughter, the tension of the past few weeks finally easing away. Hiba and Zenobia were deep in conversation about their latest training techniques, while Kaneko sipped her tea quietly, occasionally chiming in with her dry humor. Asia sat close to Issei, her smile soft as she listened to the others, clearly relieved that the danger had passed. Akeno, ever the flirtatious one, leaned back in her chair, her eyes sparkling with mischief. So, Issei, she said, her voice playful, what's it like being the god of destruction and the most eligible bachelor in Kuo? Issei turned red, his heart skipping a beat at the teasing. Come on, Akeno, don't start with that. Rias laughed softly from beside him, shaking her head. He's more than just the god of destruction, Akeno. Akeno grinned, her gaze softening. Of course he is. He's our Issei. That hasn't changed. There was a moment of quiet understanding between the group, a shared acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. The battles, the struggles, the near-death experiences, they had all forged an unbreakable bond between them. But as the night wore on, there was also an unspoken acknowledgement of the romantic entanglements that had come to define their relationships. Issei's feelings for Rias had always been clear, but there had been others, Akeno, Asia, who had loved him too. It was a delicate balance, one that had always been a part of their dynamic. As the others began to wind down for the evening, Akeno lingered by Issei's side, her expression thoughtful. She waited until the others had left the room before turning to him, her usual playful demeanor replaced with something more serious. Issei, she said quietly, I wanted to talk to you. About us. Issei swallowed nervously, already feeling his heart race. Akeno, She smiled softly, raising a hand to stop him. It's okay. I know how you feel about Rias. I've known for a long time. And I'm not angry or hurt. I've always understood. Issei felt a pang of guilt, but Akeno's gentle smile reassured him. I care about you a lot, Akeno. You've always been there for me, and I don't want to lose that. You won't, Akeno said, her eyes warm. I've come to terms with my feelings, Issei. And while things didn't turn out the way I might have imagined, I'm still happy. Happy to be by your side, and happy for you and Rias. Issei's heart swelled with gratitude and he reached out to take her hand. "You'll always be important to me, Akeno. I hope you know that." Akeno smiled, a little sad but mostly content. "I do. And I'll always be here in whatever way you need me." There was a quiet understanding between them, a mutual respect and affection that would always remain, even if their relationship had changed. Akeno had accepted that her role in Issei's life wasn't the one she had initially hoped for, but she had found peace in knowing that their bond was unbreakable. Later that night, as the mansion grew quiet and the others retired to their rooms, Issei and Riaz found themselves alone once again. They stood together on the balcony, the night sky glittering with stars above them. The world felt at peace, and for once, Issei felt no fear of the future. Riaz leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for a long while, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars. "What's next for you, Issei?" Riaz asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity. Issei smiled, his heart warm with affection for her. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But whatever it is, I know one thing: I'm not going to let this power define me. I'm the god of destruction, sure, but I'm also the guy who loves his friends. I'll protect what matters most." Riaz lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. "And what matters most?" Issei didn't hesitate. "You. Our friends. Love. That's what I want to protect." Riaz smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "You've grown so much, Issei. I'm so proud of you." Issei felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He had come a long way since the day Riaz had first saved him, and now, standing here with her, he knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "I love you," Riaz Issei said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I love you too," Issei Riaz whispered, her arms wrapping around him as she pulled him into a soft, tender kiss. As their lips met, Issei felt the weight of his power fade into the background. He wasn't just the god of destruction. He was someone who had chosen love, who had chosen to protect the people who mattered most to him. When the kiss ended, they stood together, their hands intertwined, staring out at the world before them. The night was still, the stars twinkling above, and in that moment, Issei knew that he could face whatever came next. He had found balance not just between destruction and creation, but between power and love. And with Riaz by his side, with his friend supporting him, he knew that he would protect what mattered most. As the stars flickered in the sky, Issei stood at the crossroads of destruction and creation, knowing that whatever path he chose, he would always choose love. End of the here. So that's it for today's video guys. Before you go, just like the video and share it with your friends. Bye.